the story of the Hoover Institution really does go back to Herbert Hoover himself. Herbert Hoover was a member of the first graduating class of Stanford University. And then he went off and did something that was unusual in those days, but is Peter Thiel is one who's done it. It's become much more common out here in Northern California. Herbert Hoover went off and became very rich while still very young. And then he returned to Stanford University. He built a big house, which is now used by the president of the university. In any event, the Hoover Institution was effectively founded and then refounded. After the First World War, Herbert Hoover, who was a good Quaker, had the feeling or the belief that if he sent scholars to Europe and they gathered up all the documents that they could relating to politics and economics in the period before the First World War, and then brought them back to this country, and he would he would pay for this entire effort. He and his friends would pay for this entire effort, and then scholars would study those documents. Somewhere in there, they'd find the reason for the First World War, and they would enable us all to avoid any such conflict in the future. I made a joke. In a certain sense, it was tremendously noble. I also view it as rather naive, I'm sorry to say, not for me to condescend to a truly great man, but it sidesteps the notion of what we Catholics call original sin, the notion that this is a fallen world, and you're not going. It's not as if at 2 o'clock one afternoon a scholar is going to say, "I found it," and pick up a sheet of paper with the reason for the First World War. Nevertheless, in that effectively that first founding of the Hoover Institution, Herbert Hoover established the institution's highest aims, which were democratic capitalism, freedom, and peace, and also its fundamental approach to the questions, which involves scholarship, research, reading, writing, thinking carefully inside a major university, inside Stanford University. The institution was effectively refounded in the 1960s. Herbert Hoover lived a good long time. And so when it was founded just after the First World War, originally, the Bolsheviks had won in Moscow, but Russia was consumed in civil war. By the time of the late 50s and 60s come along, the Cold War has engulfed the whole globe. And we have the beginnings of a welfare state here in the United States. And Herbert Hoover opposed both of those and helped to raise some money to hire individual fellows. So the first effort was essentially archival, pull together documents and let historians from around the world, but especially those here at Stanford, examine them. The second founding was to add to this archives a group of fellows, human beings. And these people were all in one way or another formed in this kind of refounding of the institution, formed in the struggle against communism. So you had Sidney Hook, very famous sociologist who had been a communist and then had left the party. You had Robert Conquest. He'd never been a communist, but he was originally a kind of middle of the road British, didn't disapprove of the welfare state particularly, but then and went to Spain in the Civil War to fight on the side of the Republicans, which was the wrong side to fight on if you were an anti-communist. Although Bob always claimed that he only discharged a gun once, and that was by accident. He was cleaning it and the gun thing went off. But he became an anti-communist and, of course, wrote one important work after another on the scale of the and forced starvation in Ukraine, and on the scale of the show trials, the purges. So that's sort of the second, you get the second aspect of the Hoover Institution, which is fellows. We have very few, that generation is gone. Milton Friedman, of course, belonged to that generation. They're gone now. But the idea that Hoover Fellows are formed in actual contact with the world of politics and economics, that we have plenty of academics, that's true, but we have far more people who also in one way or another, or at one time or another, were practitioners. That tends to set the Hoover Institution apart. George Shultz died a couple of years ago. He was Secretary of State. Our current director, Condoleezza Rice, also served as Secretary of State. I myself served in the Reagan administration as a speechwriter and so forth.